Cool, well, hello. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to the most interesting event of the day. This is a discussion on Islam and reform. We have two amazing speakers. I'm just your chair, so I'm not that interesting, but hi, I'm Rory. Unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't make it in the end. Fayaz, his train was cancelled and he had an absolute nightmare getting down from Manchester, but he sends his best wishes. But we still have two fantastic speakers to discuss this topic of reform and Islam. So the format we're going to go with is that our speakers will have about 5 to 10 minutes to kind of set out their stall, explain their views on the topic. And then we're going to have a bit of discussion between them, but then as much as possible we want to get a good bit of kind of questions and answers to fit into that. This is a very interesting topic. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Again, I was going to repeat Caitlin's request at the start that try and keep them to questions and not to statements. But other than that, please do fire away your questions. So to introduce our first panellist, Tehmina Kazi is Director of British Muslims for Secular Democracy. They work to promote understanding of secularism and civic engagement within British Muslim communities. I'm really excited to have you here. Tehmina, perhaps you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. For many years, I found it difficult to square the inclusive and liberal form of religion taught by my mother with the attitudes of Muslims around me. It wasn't just the religious conservatism, which is inevitable in almost any mosque in Britain, but a combination of toxic attitudes. These span the gamut from fatalism, the belief that everything is predestined, which undermines individual agency, to conspiracy theories, whatever it was, the Jews did it, to an obsession with petty externalities, being ticked off when a strand of hair was poking out of my headscarf at the mosque. Practices that run counter to basic notions of equality and human dignity, inadequate prayer spaces for women in a number of mosques, and an inability to subject intra-community injustices to either internal or external scrutiny. The prevailing attitude was, don't wash your dirty laundry in public, which neglected to mention why, after so many years, a specific criminal offence had to be drafted on forced marriage, for example. All of these people claimed to be promoting, practicing, or acting in the name of true religion. On an organisational level, groups that promote these and other reactionary positions, like the media outlet 5 Pillars, have coined a term for this. They refer to it as normative Islam. They commissioned research with 150 influential British Muslims, which sought their attitudes on a range of issues, from the nature of the caliphate to the supposed infallibility of God's revelation. 75% of respondents strongly agreed that prophetic practices were infallible. 69% thought the true caliphate was considered the ultimate Islamic model of governance for all people, while 58% thought that gender segregation in closed public settings was in the best interests of society. How is any of this compatible with a Muslim civil society that not only repudiates Puritanism and extremism, but actively embraces human rights and British values, or as I call them, universal values? Lest we forget, the Prevent Duty guidance defines extremism as vocal and active opposition to fundamental British values: democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. Some commentators, mainly on the left, set a very low bar for what constitutes counter-extremism. They assume that mainstream Muslim organisations, who issue press releases condemning the Paris attacks and set up "not in my name" campaigns in relation to ISIS must automatically be doing a good job. What these organisations and campaigns fail to do, however, is to tackle the ideology underpinning these attacks, because this involves admitting to some uncomfortable truths about Islamist political culture, both at home and abroad. For instance, some of ISIS's political and religious practices are at the most extreme end of what is already practiced in several Muslim-majority countries. Leaving Islam is a capital offence in Afghanistan, Brunei, Mauritania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Closer to home, so-called religious leaders in Bradford and Dewsbury have been praising or making excuses for Mumtaz Qadri over the last few weeks. Qadri had been put to death by the Pakistani government at the beginning of last week for his 2011 murder of Pakistani politician and anti-blasphemy law advocate Salman Taseer. The only heartening development is that these apologists for murder, like Youthway founder Imam Muhammad Asim, who has over 135,000 followers on Facebook, are being robustly challenged on their social media channels and are being reported to the relevant authorities for inciting violence. There are other examples of individuals and groups who espouse regressive values and positions, even if they do not promote violence. MPAC UK, for example, were mentioned at the all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism in 2006. The CST accused them of articulating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories through the language of anti-Zionism and describing the Talmud as a Zionist holy book. In the very mildest form, we see some appalling apologia in mainstream media outlets. On the 15th of February, The Independent carried a piece entitled "Islam and the Truth About Sex Slavery," where the author, Mariam Hakim, urged people to read the Quran's verses on sexual relations with slaves in context. In doing so, she claimed that men in the Prophet Muhammad's time were allowed to have sex with female slaves or concubines as long as the sex was consensual. It is laughable that in this day and age, commentators are attempting to justify such reprehensible acts, even on a historical basis, totally ignoring the power dynamics between a master and his slaves. Is it any wonder that according to 2 opinion polls last year by Survation and YouGov, only 22% of the UK population think that the values of Islam are compatible with the values of British society? Platitudes about Islam being a religion of peace, as well-meaning as they sometimes are, do not tell the whole story. If ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, as John Kerry asked after Paris, why is it only Muslims who join? The best way to get through the theological quagmire is to confront the violent and problematic parts of religious texts head-on, subjecting them to human reason and condemning them. This is more honest than pretending they don't exist, and more effective than claiming they've been taken out of context. Progressive theologians like Sheikh Khalid Abu al-Fadl urge Muslims to read the Quran according to its highest moral imperatives, with kindness, mercy and justice, even if against one's own family members, at the forefront. While this is a laudable approach, we have to accept that those who publicly promote truly liberal and progressive interpretations of Islam are still in the minority and are working on building a critical mass. Genuine reformers like Majid Nawaz and Usama Hasan here, and as well as Sarah Khan of the group Inspire, are pilloried even by some high-profile Muslims who take moderate positions on other issues. In the meantime, the hardliners of this world can claim their brand of Islam as normative and true without any major challenges, attracting more and more young followers. Rather than engaging in a tit-for-tat about who follows the true Islam, we should change the parameters of the debate completely. In theological terms, this involves genuine and long-term introspection of religious texts and widespread beliefs, and the championing of alternative religious spaces, like the LGBT-friendly Inclusive Mosque Initiative. In civic terms, this means prioritising equality and human rights over subjective interpretations of religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tehmina. Again, you'll have time for questions in a bit, but first we're going to hear from Usama Hasan. Usama is a senior research fellow at the Quilliam Foundation and co-founder of Quilliam. Quilliam are working directly on issues of reform within British Islam. They're also interested in setting up street societies at the moment. It's especially interesting to hear about that. So, Usama, please go ahead.
Is it okay if I stand?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. With the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honour to speak here. It's actually not the first time I've spoken at Conway Hall. Believe it or not, back in the late 80s, early 90s, this very hall was hired for the annual conference which my own father held for his Quran Society charity. And this hall was packed, and the gallery, the women were in the gallery, of course, gender segregation. And we had two annual conferences there, actually, back in the late 80s. I doubt somehow whether Conway Hall would allow that kind of thing now, but maybe we should try. So, as I said, I'm very honoured to be here again. There's a great history in this hall itself. And I speak, of course, as a post-Islamist, like many of us at Quilliam. People who gave many years of our lives, actually, for the Islamist cause. In other words, dreaming and working for Islamic revolution everywhere, an Islamic state, caliphate, to impose the Sharia, or our particular interpretation of the Sharia, and to expand that by military means through our understanding of jihad. Now, I spent roughly 20 years as a committed Islamist, from my early teens through to my early 30s, including a brief spell as a foreign fighter in Afghanistan against the Afghan communists, so that part of the jihad. I was a first year undergraduate, second year undergraduate at Cambridge University at the time, studying natural sciences and physics. I took part in the jihad there, training and fighting. So I'm a former foreign fighter. Some of my colleagues at Quilliam did that kind of thing. Majid Nawaz was, of course, in prison in Egypt for 3 years. But one thing we all had in common was, through our journey, we realized actually that these rather simplistic notions, very utopian, revolutionary ideas about changing the world through glorious Islamic revolution everywhere, actually did not make any sense. And also, when we saw the reality of some of the movements of groups fighting, literally fighting, for that purpose, we saw how corrupt they were often in terms of a grab for power and money being dressed up in religious terms. And of course the 9/11 and the 7/7 bombings and all this kind of global terrorism in the name of Islam set off alarm bells ringing, or amplified alarm bells which had run way before that actually, and led to a lot of soul searching, and so many of us came out with the kind of work that we do now. But remaining as devout Muslims, right? I mean, I said my prayer before I came here. I was a devout Muslim. I'd learned the Quran as a young man, and my work is especially on the theology. So I'm going to try to just mention some of the key arguments and, in fact, movements that I see taking place within the British Muslim communities as well as worldwide, which I think will be of interest to the AHS as a student body. So, firstly, I'd like to plug my own work, and that of Quilliam. One of the books which many of you may have read was our co-founder Majid Nawaz's dialogue with Sam Harris, of course. It's called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, published by Harvard University Press at the end of last year. If you haven't read that already, you may well be interested in that. Majid and Sam, it's a dialogue, and they discuss some of the crucial issues around the interpretation of the Quran, the nature and status of the Quran, and how Muslims do, in fact, and can adopt liberal and democratic values while remaining true to their faith. So that's a highly recommended book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and it's a kind of bestseller in various categories already. In my own work, I've published 3 religious reform papers in Quilliam. They're all on the Quilliam Foundation website. The first one is about extremism and balance. The second one is about religious freedom, and it's based on the verse of the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. The third one is a 100-page essay, it's really a book, on the rights of non-Muslims under Islamic law and how that evolved over the centuries. So, there are many interpretations of Sharia, there always have been. So the Islamists who say we want Sharia, it's a very, almost a meaningless slogan and claim, because there's never been one Sharia. Sharia is basically the Arabic term for law, sacred law. But, law, yeah. There have been secular interpretations of Sharia before. But there have been literally dozens of interpretations of Sharia, schools of thought, and they differ widely, even on basic issues like where do we get law and theology from? Is it from revelation, or is it from reason? Is it from tradition, or from the intellect? Those are basic issues which were discussed in early Islam. So Sharia had all had different interpretations. Now I'm tracing my latest publication how the status of non-Muslims in Sharia kind of evolved over the centuries, especially in the later period, the Ottoman period, and the Mughals in India and other places. So that's my work. Another initiative I was involved with recently was the Muslim Reform Movement. If you go to muslimreformmovement.org, you will see the declaration there. This is something we launched in Washington, D.C. Just in December. And it's a declaration with, I don't know, about 10, 12 paragraphs. But it's in 3 major areas: peace, human rights, and secular governance. So in there we explicitly call for universal human rights. We endorse the UDHR. For those who don't know, there's something called the so-called Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, issued by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, in Cairo in about 1990, and that's a really problematic document. We reject that, and we affirm the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because we see it as consistent with all the major world religions and humanist traditions, and something which can actually unite the world. And we call for the explicit separation of mosque and state. So that's the Muslim Reform Movement, which is an international kind of movement there. Related to some of my work, I was also in Marrakesh in January for the Marrakesh Declaration, which was again about the status of non-Muslims in Muslim majority countries, and again a call for complete equality, complete civic equality in Muslim majority countries. The final initiative I've been involved with is over the last 2 years I've convened a major international task force on Islam and science, especially Muslim responses to science's big questions, the big questions that science poses for theology and for religion, such as the nature of existence and arguments around God and all that kind of thing. That report will be published on Monday, finally. It's taken us 2 years together, but we've come up with a 230-page report with invited papers. And that will be published on the muslim-science.com website. So I hope that will be of interest to some of you. It is, of course, something close to my heart because, as well as being a trained imam, a theologian, I'm also a trained physicist and scientist and astronomer. Right, so those are some of the intellectual arguments which I'm happy to explore in the Q&A. I hope you will have some questions around those. But as you will have guessed, I suppose, as a believer, but also a scientist, I see the science-religion conversation as fascinating, and I think it's a conversation that should continue. But there are millions of believers like myself, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, who see science and religion kind of converging in the kind of question they ask and in what should be the kind of spirit of inquiry, searching for truth. I've also made the argument for why based on the Quranic tradition itself. You can separate the mosque from state, especially on the basis of the Prophet Muhammad's teaching, that you know your worldly affairs better. The teaching when the Prophet says to his disciples that I come to teach you about being better people and getting closer to God, spiritual training, but you know your worldly affairs better. Now, this particular teaching was used by Ibn Khaldun, the great historian of the 14th century, repeatedly in his Muqaddimah, in his history, in his introduction to history, which Arnold Toynbee described as the greatest book ever written. So Ibn Khaldun took this view that Islam had a strong secular tradition there, so he rejected the idea of sacred medicine or sacred science, for example, which feeds into some of our Islamic science discussions. But the final thing I will end with, actually, for now, is about post-Islamism. As I said, many of us at Quilliam, including myself, were Islamists. Now, of course, we oppose the narrowness of Islamism, but we're literally talking about millions of Muslims worldwide who have adopted and been brought up in these kind of Islamist ideas for the last century or so. And some of it with understandable reasons, for example, anti-colonial and post-colonial kind of political movements, which still animate a lot of the Islamists worldwide. And I'm actually very interested in trying to show one way of how people can move beyond that kind of Islamism. And my colleague Dilwar Hussain and others have also written about post-Islamism. And before I do that, I'll just say something about students and the university scenario. Okay, as Rory mentioned, since September we have set up 4 or 5 Quilliam societies at universities around the UK. We're in the process of setting up another 4 or 5. If you're interested, do get in touch with us. I think the Right to Debate people should be here. They have a store. That's linked to our work there as well. But of course, a lot of our work is opposed. My work, Tehmina's work, Quilliam's work, other like-minded people, is opposed by the Islamic societies on campus. I mean, when I spoke at Plymouth University 2 years ago, there was an orchestrated campaign to try to get that lecture banned. And that's a common pattern elsewhere. We should be aware of the nature of FOSIS. FOSIS is a federation of student Islamic societies. It's like the NUS for Muslims in this country. FOSIS has explicitly Islamist roots. It was set up in the 60s in Britain, and many of its leaders were members of the Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat Islami in India and Pakistan, and more lately of Salafi and even jihadist groups. So that's something which is kind of fact, well known to the Muslim communities, and we should be aware of. So, for example, Isam Bashir, who was a minister in the Islamist government in Sudan, was once the head of FOSIS here in Britain in the 60s and 70s. FOSIS of the last few years has become increasingly conservative or extreme, you could say. The recent head of FOSIS, one before last, explicitly said he was a Salafi. FOSIS invited to the annual conference Haytham al-Haddad regularly for the last few years, who was divisive and sectarian views, actually very well known, very misogynistic, very sectarian, very anti-Shia, opposed to democracy, opposed to what he calls Western influence everywhere. And at the same time, the same group was inviting Haytham al-Haddad, but opposing Quilliam's work everywhere. I was actually on their annual conference invite list in 2008. I was due to speak there, because people were interested in post-Islamist discourse. Yeah, I'd worked with FOSIS before. But that invitation was retracted when Quilliam was launched in 2008, for example. But what we would like, I would certainly like to see is dialogue with groups like FOSIS, and not both sides trying to ban the other and having this kind of censorship, which is what our Right to Debate campaign, starting with Quilliam and other student leaders around the country, is about, is to say, don't ban speakers even if they're controversial, but challenge them, debate them. So finally, those 4 principles, I and Majid Nawaz and others, independently identified 4 major principles of Islamism, as opposed to Islam, right? Islam has 5 pillars, which are faith, prayer, charity, pilgrimage, and fasting. It is something actually shared by all the major world religious traditions, which many Muslims have to realize. The 5 pillars of Islam are not unique. they are common to all the major world religions. But Islamism, the political movement, which came out of the Muslim majority countries, partly as an anti-colonial phenomenon, has four major principles. The first one is the idea of ummah. So the Muslims as a worldwide community, a single community worldwide. Now this has positive elements because you're taught this kind of brotherly and sisterly connection to other people who you don't really know, and encourage you to be friendly with them. It's actually a very powerful force, the idea of the ummah. But it also has a dark side to it, which is the divisiveness. It becomes us versus them. So if you're not a Muslim, of course, it becomes Muslim versus non-Muslim. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda, groups like that, are a very extreme example of that. But this is a serious problem, actually, in Muslim communities worldwide. And I argue, as do others, that actually the deeper reading of the Quran shows very clearly that humanity is one ummah in the Quran. The ultimate ummah or nation is humanity. We're all descended from the same source. We are one human race. So if Muslims are to talk about ummah, we should be talking about the human race as our nation. And in fact, that is one of the principles in the Muslim Reform Declaration, which is our ummah is all of humanity, not just Muslims. So that's the first principle. The second one is about caliphate. Because if you have an idea that you are one global community apart from everybody else, a natural idea which follows from that is that you have to have your own territory, your own land, right? The nations have states, nation states, for example. That's where the idea of the caliphate comes from, Islamic State, Dar al-Islam, land of Islam. And that has to be challenged, the idea that you must have a single state covering all Muslims, the caliphate, which of course ISIS have finally declared, that other groups like Al-Qaeda, before that the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat Islami, have been struggling for the last century for. So they can't really complain. As Tehmina said, when some groups say we're opposed to ISIS, that's not good enough. Are you also opposed to the very divisive ideas which have inspired and animated ISIS and led to what they're doing right now? That has to be challenged as well. And there, of course, for example, we point to the fact that the Shiites within Islam never accepted the caliphate anyway. And the caliphate is a Sunni political model. It's not a Shia one. Secondly, and Ibn Khaldun argued again, he said there was one caliphate in early Islamic history when the Muslim community was small, but later in Islamic history there were multiple caliphates around. And there's no problem with that, because the idea was the rule of law and governance, just governance. That was the idea behind the caliphate. It wasn't supposed to be a single dictatorship forever, which is what ISIS are trying to recreate. So that's the second principle. The third one is Sharia, or interpretation of Sharia. Because once you have a community, and then you have the state, the territory which it governs, then you have law in that country or in that state. And that's where the Islamists want their particular narrow version of Sharia to rule. And as we see with ISIS, that discriminates against women, it discriminates against non-Muslims, against gays and lesbians, homosexuals. It has very harsh draconian penalties for anything which is deemed to be immoral behavior. And as I argued before, that is one very narrow interpretation of Sharia which is taken by force against the Quranic principle of no compulsion in religion. And there have been, as I said, dozens of interpretations of Sharia throughout history, including the ones that many reformers around the world like us promote, which are gender equal and which give full equality to everyone, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, sexuality, etc. So that's the third principle. The final one is jihad, which is used by the terrorists actually to justify their terrorism. Now, jihad throughout Islamic history was a kind of sacred war, very similar to the idea of the Christian just war. The Christian just war idea. It was always about ethical warfare. The idea of ethics was very strong within jihad from the beginning. In fact, the greatest theologians and jurists of today accept that, and they promote that, in fact, that the idea behind all of this was peace and compassion. The Prophet Muhammad and Muslims only took up arms when they were persecuted. They originally were entirely peaceful. And the Quran has a teaching, withhold your hands, which is similar to the Christian teaching of turn the other cheek, actually, not to fight back. They're actually only fought back to guarantee religious freedom and to defend their rights. But that idea of jihad, of course, worldwide is often twisted into something very nasty, especially in terrorism. So those are four major areas where I believe that Muslims who wish to be devout Muslims can still hold on to their faith, but make those principles much wider and much more inclusive, and get away from the serious problems that Islamism faces. And I think these are issues which must be debated and discussed on university campuses. As I said, many of the Islamic societies are heavily dominated by Islamist activists, often against the wishes of the majority of the Muslim population on campus who just want a peaceful existence. And the fact is that over the last 30 years, we have had at least 50 or 60 terrorists have come out of British universities. These are people who are convicted of terrorism, or who have become suicide bombers, or carried out terrorist attacks. There's a long list of names which I could reel off, but there are many people in denial about this. But for example, Omar Sheikh, who was still on death row in Pakistan for the murder of Daniel Pearl, the kidnapping and murder of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street journalist. He was an NSC chap who tried to blow up an airliner on Christmas Day 2009 over Detroit, was it? Omar Farooq Abdul Muttalib was president of the Islamic Society at UCL, which is the stone's throw from here. Baba Ahmed at Imperial College. And there are many other examples. So we cannot be in denial about the extent historically of this issue on our universities and to trace where that came from. But as I said, Tehmina's work, Quilliam's work, I hope, and many others are actually trying to do what we can to challenge and to change the discourse around these issues, and I look forward to your input and your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Usama. So we want to make this as interactive as possible, so we can kind of almost jump straight to Q&A, but I thought I would take advantage of my position in chair and ask my question first. So you've both been talking a lot about the need for conversations and the idea of just getting a debate out there. No one's been mentioning things like we need to have more police action and along those lines. On campuses in particular, just because that's what I'm thinking is especially relevant, do you feel those conversations are happening? So for example, we're having a conversation around Islam and reform, but with an atheist sector's audience. Are these conversations happening, do you think, in universities? And what are the challenges to this happening? Maybe Tehmina.
It is happening, but it's happening on a very sporadic level. For example, we organised something a few years ago with Manwa Ali, who's another former extremist, and now works to promote, in this particular talk, he was actually promoting the idea of secular democracy. And now it had enabled him to educate other people about Islam without imposing his religion on them. And we held this at Queen Mary University and brought a lot of people along. And there were people on the fence who said that listening to Manwa say these things actually changed their minds on whether it was possible to be a Muslim who also supported secular democracy. So these events are taking place, but very, very slowly. And I find that ISOCs, University Islamic Societies, they will not invite speakers like Manwa or myself or Osama or Majid Nawaz or Sarah Khan. They will not invite anyone who's reformist-minded. It's just the usual suspects, the Haytham al-Haddads of this world, people with very conservative and, quite hardline viewpoints. And what I'd really like to see is greater dialogue between AHS societies on campus and Islamic societies, and perhaps hosting events with humanist and Muslim speakers that sort of have that span the entire spectrum from conservative to liberal, and also ex-Muslims as well.
And do you see there being, what kind of challenges do you think there are to study that kind of thing? Do you think there's an appetite within ISOC to say, we'll get that go? Or is that,
Not really. I think that there needs to be a lot of bridge building and relationship building between humanist and secular societies and ISOCs before that can even begin to happen on any serious level.
And because you've come from a very interesting background and has been in business, you can essentially know what that is. Do you think that your kind of journey can be repeated by, I think you do, you're looking at Quilliam Foundation, but how likely do you think it is that you can win people over? Like, how big is that challenge?
Yeah, thank you. I think we are slowly winning that challenge, and the debates are opening up. And outside events help us sometimes. For example, after ISIS came along, Quilliam was able to say, "We told you so. We've been warning about this kind of thing since 2008." And a lot of people after ISIS declared the caliphate said, actually you guys were right, because they didn't think our warning were true, that you could have such a brutal kind of fascist regime in the name of these ideas. Now, Manor Ali Tehmina mentioned, he's the one who took it to Afghanistan. In fact, I remember him speaking here back in the late 80s, early 90s, and actually a really extremist rant. I remember even I was shocked at the time. He went very far. But he's a completely different person now. So what I have seen, I've been at Quilliam for 4 years now, and for the first couple of years it was tough. As I said, the group called IERA were behind the campaign at Quilliam University to try to close down my talk. FOSA's tried to shut my talk at Exeter University just a few months ago. And that caused a lot of stress personally. At Plymouth I was really angry at the fact that there was an elderly professor in his 60s who was hosting me. And I'm younger than her, so I had to defer to her. I was very angry at the amount of stress they put her through. Because until the last moment, we didn't know whether my talk was going to go ahead or not. And I'd taken a 4 or 5 hour train from London to Plymouth. And that was absolutely out of order, what they did at Plymouth. And the really sad thing about that was other people who were well-intentioned but naive actually joined IERA because they said, I'm an Islamophobe. Like, how long I've memorized the Quran, I've been an imam for 30 years, I need the prayers. How can I be an Islamophobe? But sadly, the local Forces Society, the local LGBT and other groups were duped by the Islamist activists at IERA. But not for long, because actually student rights helped to expose them. And I think when Tehmina said, get ex-Muslims and others involved, many of you will know what happened with Maryam Namazi last year at Goldsmith, and the ISOP members again, disrupting that. The fact that was captured on YouTube, and many people saw it, helped shame those people, basically, who didn't dare try that again. So just last week, Maryam Namazi spoke with one of my colleagues, Farhana Meir, who's also a Quran scholar and a theologian at Quilliam. They spoke together at Kent University in Canterbury last week, and it went very well. And we're actually slowly getting ISOP panel members approaching us to say, we want to hear more of this generous, kind of humanist, if you like, approach to Islam. Adam Dean we've recruited recently. He's our head of outreach. He was with one of the most extreme groups, Al-Hajirun, who are basically ISIS UK, right? Adam Dean spent about 10 years with them. But so he understands that mindset as well. And he's a very kind of intelligent and charismatic speaker. So he's doing the odd talks at universities. I think the public pressure, the public awareness of these issues has helped, because basically the small group of committed activists have pulled the wool over many people's eyes for decades, and they can't do that so easily anymore. And we actually need everybody's help with continuing those conversations. I think it's good news. Next week we have the British Islam Conference, organised by New Horizons. The keynote speaker is Amina Wadood, world-famous feminist Quran scholar who wrote books on the Quran and women. When I was growing up, Amina Wadood was a hated figure, because she dared to question kind of male interpretation of Islam. She led prayers. She was a female imam. She led men in prayer. Because I was brought up in Islamic circles, I was kind of taught to almost hate Amina Wadood. Amina Wadood is now a good friend of ours, and she is the keynote speaker at this major British Islam conference next week at Coventry University. So things are changing. I think that's a good news. We just need to continue that momentum and keep building.
If people have questions, put your hand up and we can do it. Yeah. I think you have the mic. I think this fellow here.
I couldn't go without it.
Hi. So, in relation to, so obviously Islam is the religion of a lot of ethnic minorities in the UK. For British Muslims, do you think that the future is going to be more integrated? Or do you think that perhaps the tension between maybe more hard right people is going to result in perhaps very dramatic change in the next few years, or do you think it will just sort of fizzle out and these barriers will become less important?
Well, great question. I think we are at a bit of a crossroads. It could go either way. I mean, I see a lot of positive activity within British Muslim communities. And I said, it's a very young community, by the way, or communities. The British Muslim communities, the census shows something like 60% are under 25 or 30, whatever it is, in comparison to the rest of the population. It's a very young community, so you have a lot of questioning going on and lots of new trends and things. On the other hand, there is increasing anti-Muslim kind of feeling and Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred across Europe, including in Britain. Groups like Media and Britain First, etc., beginning in the UK now, are a good example of that. Because those groups started in opposition to Islamist extremism, or Muslim extremism, and then broadened out to becoming this anti-Islam and Muslim in general. And that is a serious social challenge, I think. So I think there are processes of integration and inclusion going on. There are other processes with extreme on the Islamists and the far right and far left side who are quite dangerous. And I do worry about violence. We've had bits of violence and terrorism already. I do worry it could spiral out of control if we're not careful, which is why we need more people not to sit on the fence or be spectators in all this, but actually be activists towards positive, fruitful dialogue and conversation.
I think things are becoming more and more polarised. So you've got the groups like Cage and other groups that sort of peddle a hardline narrative. They're gaining ground, but then so are the liberal and progressive groups. I mean, a few years ago, you would never have seen something like the Inclusive Mosque Initiative being set up. I mean, when I first started in this space, working in this space about 7 years ago, there was nothing like it. A pop-up mosque where openly LGBT people on the committee, which is totally inclusive to Muslim women, Muslims from minority backgrounds like Ahmadi and Shia Muslims and others. You wouldn't have seen an organisation like this when I first started out, and it's getting more and more powerful and better. Now when we're funded, we actually have 2 paid members of staff, so it's doing really, really well. So I'm really positive that there'll be more and more liberal and progressive groups coming into this space.
Should we just make Lizzie run back and forth with the person back there? So, John.
Hi. I was wondering to what extent you both think the government's prevent legislation, has that helped or has that hindered the moderate Muslim voice on campuses?
Right, well, I'm actually speaking about this tomorrow at the University of Leicester. I think Prevent has been excessively demonised in the press. Don't get me wrong, when the policy first started out, I was quite critical of it, particularly the excessive surveillance aspects, like Project Champion in Birmingham, which had security cameras placed disproportionately in majority Muslim areas. But after listening to practitioner feedback, the government actually scrapped those aspects of Prevent, and now these days it's far more positive and constructive. I've actually heard of examples where Prevent has led to people not only individuals being de-radicalised, but things like teachers and practitioners being able to speak openly about taboo and controversial topics, and that's directly because of the Prevent duty guidance. So there's a lot of positive stuff around Prevent that we generally don't hear about because the impact of the Prevent lobby is so strong.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I have to be honest, I actually work for Prevent, part-time, very part-time, but I do get called in to speak to vulnerable young men usually, who are being groomed basically for terrorism, and to try to influence them away from that path. So I have to set my stall out on that. And of course, those of us who work in Prevent are also very critical of Prevent, but there is an organised campaign against Prevent, led by the Islamists actually, groups like Cage who have clearly been apologists for Al-Qaeda in the past, and some of the members clearly have been apologists for terrorists. I'll say that. And again, many well-meaning and naive people, again, have got involved with the anti-prevent campaign because of its mistakes. Of course, they have mistakes. The Labour government has started it, coalition and Tory government continued it. What we actually need is constructive criticism of prevent. Even the name, I think, is a negative sounding name. But it's one of the 4 Ps of the government's counter-terrorism policy. So I think to rename it would have to begin with P. And one of our research interns actually suggested the name promote, which I think is a great idea, promote kind of social cohesion and debate and dialogue. So I'm actually going to start campaigning for the government to change the name of prevent to promote. And I hope those of you agree will kind of join me in that. But you know, I know many colleagues who have helped change young people's lives around and stop them going off to Syria to die. So actually, I don't worry too much about the criticism because I know how important that work is. But one of the troubling aspects actually was about freedom of speech on universities. I think this current government went too far on that. As one of the vice chancellors reminded me, there is a statute which obliges universities to also uphold free speech. So free speech is not just a universal human rights issue, it's also a particular university statutory requirement, as well as now the requirement to prevent terrorism. So that's why at Quilliam one of the reasons why we came up with the right to debate idea, which was don't ban extremist speakers, but put in place mechanisms where they must be challenged, so that they don't get the floor to themselves, but there is a way that opposing viewpoints are put in there. So I think, yeah, censorship is one of the areas where prevent has probably gone too far and needs to be rolled back.
I've got 2 questions, but I'll keep them really brief. The first one is, Islamism is obviously a political, it's politics. If it collapses globally, which I hope that it will, what do you think will replace it? Will there be a lot of apathy from all those people who are Islamists? And the second is, how important are ex-Muslims in this conversation about extremism? Because often I feel that Muslim reformers are in some ways might be damaged by working with ex-Muslims because they already find it difficult to engage with the Muslim community. So where do you find what we do to fit into this kind of conversation about reform? Thanks.
Sure, okay. The ex-Muslims are really important because they are, just by your presence, you are a challenge to the Islamists who are basically trying to convert everybody to Islam and stop anybody leaving Islam with the threat of death. And the other aspect of this is that some people naively say things like, if you're not Muslim or if you're an ex-Muslim, you have no right to talk about Islam or critique. And I just think that's nonsense. I mean, as a scientist and also a theologian, if you have a discussion around truth or the search for truth, whatever that is, you basically can't exclude anybody. I mean, you have to have rational, scientific, intellectual conversation, and you judge people by what they say, not just who they are. The ex-Muslims, in fact, they also know the Muslim communities and the experience very well. So in fact, ex-Muslims have perhaps more of a right to speak than other people. So your work and Imtiaz's work is absolutely crucial. And again, I see things changing. So, for example, last year on the BBC Big Questions programme, on precisely this question about apostasy and leaving religion. Should there be freedom to leave religion? There was a Somali lady, much like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She had very similar views to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but she was now an agnostic or an ex-Muslim. And there was also a Muslim woman in the audience who gave her a hug afterwards. I witnessed that. She said, "Look, we don't agree on the faith, but you're a lovely person, and here, let's have a hug." And you wouldn't have seen that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I'm convinced because the Islamist rhetoric against ex-Muslims was so strong. It was a really taboo issue. It's still a taboo issue, of course. There's the case of Nizam Hussain in Bradford, who became a Christian, left Islam for Christianity, has been intimidated and was recently attacked again outside his home in Bradford, landed in hospital simply for leaving Islam. And I must say, sadly, the churches have failed there, including the Church of England in Bradford. I thought the Church of England was going to give him the support that he needed. They've done nothing, basically, because of interfaith relation, which I work in, but interfaith is important. It doesn't stop you from basically taking basic moral stances. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of empowering people to do the right thing, basically, and to have the courage to stand up for people's rights and not be worried too much about their reputation and all the rest of it.
I mean, we've always worked with ex-Muslim groups and other humanist and atheist groups, and I think that's something that we should do a lot more of, particularly in regards to what used to be known as interfaith social action, which I think should be interbelief or interconviction or whatever the correct term is. We should be getting people from all backgrounds with all kinds of belief systems together to work on projects that concern the whole community. For example, a few years ago we ran something called People Like Us Interfaith, where we got different communities to share good practice on issues like work, family, education and bereavement, issues that affect us all. And we got humanists, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Hindus, all to work together on these difficult topics. And it was a very productive conversation.
Can I just add one thing to that? Just reminded me, which is, I think, fit for the tradition there, and as a scientist, I mean, I have my Eastern kind of Islamic heritage, but also the Western scientific heritage, and I really enjoy that. The Western scientists, physicists and mathematicians are some of my greatest heroes. One of my favourite incidents is from Isaac Newton, if you read his biography. I think it's with Robert Boyle, I think that's it. Two men were friends and also rivals at the time, and I think it's right. It may be somebody else, I think it's Boyle. Boyle was an atheist, or become an atheist, whereas Newton was, of course, a believer and a Unitarian, and the Unitarian helped with developing religious humanism, for example. And Boyle once said to Newton something about why he was wrong to believe in God, but still be a theist. And Newton just replied in a friendly way. He said, "You, sir, have not studied theology, I have." Right? Now, whether or not you agree which side of that debate you're on, the point is they were friends. And this is like 4 centuries ago, where people could be friends, even though one was a theist and one was an atheist. And we actually had something similar in large parts of the Muslim world, the Muslim majority world for centuries. That spirit of debate and openness is what has been lost in many areas. That's really what's crucial. And the Quranic principle of no compulsion in religion, and also for you your religion, for me mine. Although we have to have shared values and an agreed social contract for society to work. That's the key issue. What are the shared values? What is the social contract? But really, trying to force one faith on another, as the major world religions have done for centuries, that time is gone, and people have to really take that on board.
And the kind of religious organisations that would have a problem working with progressive or secular Muslims would usually have a problem working with ex-Muslims too, so we're very much on the same page anyway.
Pop your hands up. I would go. I'm not sure where to. Just Jenny. Jenny. Oh, right.
Hi. I have a question for each of you, really. I was just wondering, Islam used the term ISIS a lot. I've heard people refer to it as IS or Islamic State or so-called Islamic State or Daesh. I was just wondering why you use ISIS, or whether you think there's a case for calling it either way. And also, Tehmina, I was wondering, there's a big stereotype of women not being treated well in Muslim communities or Islam, and you're talking so much about like a reformed version of Islam. How would you sort of fight those stereotypes, or what would you change in order, in an ideal world, to sort of fight those stereotypes and those issues?
In terms of fighting stereotypes, a few years ago I was involved with something called the Muslim Women Power List, which was a list of the most powerful Muslim women in the UK, women who really excelled in their own particular fields. And this was really important in terms of promoting visibility of Muslim women as role models, as people who've achieved something of note. And that was a really positive initiative. But in terms of changing things within Muslim communities, we still had a long way to go. my colleagues at the Muslim women's organisation Inspire are doing their best to promote an egalitarian interpretation of Islam, and they've been running workshops up and down the country with Muslim women, empowering them in terms of being able to, giving them the skills to challenge extremism within their own communities and their own families. They've done this roadshow called Making a Stand, which dissuades young women from joining extremist groups like ISIS and others, and they're doing wonderful work. So I'd say, go and support groups like those. And also, there are other groups of Muslim women who've been trying to change the status quo through using democratic and legal means. For example, a group of women challenged Hounslow Mosque for barring them from voting in mosque elections. They tried all other alternate, or all sort of, they tried many attempts at mediation with the mosque elders. Those all failed. So what they eventually did was take the mosque to court, and they won. Yeah.
So ISIS. If I can just say a couple of words about the Muslim women's issue. So Inspire is a great organisation. There's also the Muslim Women's Network, and there are many others working on the issue. If I can just say a brief word about theology. It really boils down to a global debate, actually, and we need more of this on campuses, about interpretation of the role of women, of Muslim women, or women in Islam, and the Quranic teachings about them. Because on the one hand, there are some very clear egalitarian verses in the Quran which say men and women are completely equal in every respect. They're equal human beings, they're equal before God. The Quran does not blame Eve, for example. The Quran has the story of Adam and Eve and the fall, but does not blame Eve at all. Actually blamed Adam more than Eve for the fall. So that's one difference from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which should make it easier for Muslim women actually, but sadly hasn't. But there are specific verses in the Quran around particular rulings, like inheritance, divorce, marriage, and kind of family social issues. And the big argument really throughout the Muslim world is which of these verses take precedence? The very general egalitarian verses of the Quran, or the kind of specific ones which put men and women in different categories. And basically, the fundamentalists or Islamists elevate the specific verses and say men and women must always be separate, different roles, different status. And the reformers, if you like, or universalists like ourselves, who say no, actually it's the universal verses which must take preference. The other ones were specifically in the context of 7th century Arabia, and they were actually huge strides forward at the time. In 7th century Arabia, the Quran gave women property rights, equal property rights, half the inheritance, but that was better than no inheritance. Half the witnesses, the status of witnesses, again better than being subhuman beings, basically. It was a step forward. The argument of the reformer is the Quran was a step forward for women's rights in the 7th century, and that process must be continued towards full liberation, just as with slavery, full equality, full gender equality. That's the basic Quranic argument for full gender equality, which I make and many others make. But the fundamentalist interpretation says, no, you can't do that. Those verses are also eternal, and you must keep this disparity between men and women. Very quickly about the naming of ISIS. It's blown out of all proportion, that whole debate actually, although words have their importance. But ISIS, ISIL and Daesh are basically the same thing. The name of the group in Arabic was that. Sham is translated as either Syria or Greater Syria in English, but Greater Syria is the Levant, hence the difference between ISIS and ISIL. And of course the group itself renamed itself to Islamic State, and the Caliphate. They also called themselves the Caliphate State. So that's of course why the BBC called it the Islamic State, and the government said called it the so-called Islamic State. I just prefer to use ISIS because it's easier to say than ISIL or IS. But by the way, a lot of businesses called ISIS have gone out of business. So it's one of the reasons why the British and American governments actually prefer ISIL over ISIS. Because I think a lot of businesses called ISIS, some of them had to rename themselves. So I should say ISIL or Daesh or something. But I just find it easy to say ISIS. Apologies. But I think we should focus on their theology and the ideology and what's really going on. Yeah. But words are important as well. Names are important.
Unfortunately, we haven't time for further questions, but you might get a chance to catch people after, potentially. As a final thing to finish on, I think both our speakers have talked about the importance of AHS societies engaging with ISOC or a Quilliam society, or just other Muslim students who maybe don't agree with their ISOC. And that's something that I think I've seen quite a lot of our societies do, is organise discussions and dialogue with ISOC, which is inviting Muslims in. So maybe that's something I think would be quite a nice thing to take forward from this panel, has been that we can actually, we're being helpful in doing that. Thank you so much to Usama and to Tehmina, and thank you all for your really interesting questions.